The night stretched endlessly over the city, swallowing the streets in cold, merciless silence. The streetlights flickered weakly, casting long shadows across the cracked pavement. The occasional car rumbled past in the distance, its tires hissing against the damp road, but the world remained eerily still. Beneath one of those flickering streetlights, unnoticed by the world, lay a tiny, fragile figure. A puppy. He was barely more than skin and bones, his fur matted with dirt and dust. His small body trembled from the night chill, his ribs pressing painfully against his thin skin. His eyes, half-lidded and clouded with exhaustion, barely registered the towering buildings around him. His legs had given up hours ago. He had tried to keep walking, tried to keep going, but his body was too weak. He had not eaten in days. The last time he had felt warmth, safety, love, he could not even remember. He had once belonged somewhere, had once been part of something. But now? He was alone. The city moved on without him. The people passed him by, their faces blurred with indifference. Some did not notice him. Others did not care. He had once hoped that someone would stop, that someone would see him. But no one ever did. And now, lying there on the freezing concrete, his tiny body too weak to move, his breaths too shallow to keep up with the weight of the night. He was not sure he could fight any longer. A gust of wind swept through the empty street, rattling a loose piece of newspaper. The paper drifted across the pavement, skimming over the puppy's frail body like a whisper. A reminder that he was still there. That he still existed. But for how much longer? His breathing slowed. His eyelids grew heavier. The hunger in his stomach had long since faded into a dull ache, replaced by an emptiness that felt bottomless. His tiny paws curled in on themselves, his body instinctively trying to preserve what little warmth he had left. Somewhere in the distance, laughter echoed from an alleyway. The sound was distant, meaningless. A reminder that life continued, that the world did not stop for those left behind. A pair of boots clattered against the sidewalk nearby, the hurried steps of someone heading home. The puppy did not lift his head. He had learned by now. No one would stop. No one ever did. Then, footsteps. Not the hurried kind that rushed past without a glance. Not the heavy, careless kind that trampled through puddles and left everything behind. These were different. They slowed, hesitated, stopped. A shadow fell over the tiny body lying motionless on the pavement. For the first time in what felt like forever, someone was looking at him. A pair of hands, gentle and warm, reached down. Soft fingers brushed against his fur, dirty, tangled, but still soft beneath the grime. The touch startled him. For a moment, his weak body tensed, expecting pain, expecting to be shoved aside like he had been before. But then, the hands did not hurt him. They lifted him, held him, wrapped him in warmth. He was weightless in the stranger's arms, his small frame fitting perfectly in the cradle of their embrace. For the first time in days, he felt warmth seep into his skin. A voice, soft and filled with something he had forgotten existed, whispered, "You are not alone anymore." The stranger looked down at the puppy in their arms, their heart twisting. He was so small, so fragile. And yet, he was still breathing, still fighting. Even after everything, he was still here. They could have walked away. They could have told themselves it was not their problem, that the city was filled with strays, that the world was cruel and unfair, and sometimes, that was just how things were. But as they held the trembling body against their chest, as they felt the faintest rise and fall of his fragile ribcage, they knew. This was not just another stray. This was not just another story of suffering lost in the streets of a cold, indifferent city. This was a life that still had a chance. And they would not walk away. Not this time. The stranger moved quickly, cradling the puppy close as they hurried toward their car. His body was frighteningly still. His breathing, so faint, so fragile. But he was alive. And they were not going to let him slip away. They slid into the driver's seat, turning the heat on full blast, wrapping the puppy in their coat as they dialed a number with shaking hands. "Dr. Mason, I found him on the street. He is barely breathing. Please, I need help." The veterinarian's voice was urgent. "Bring him in now." The stranger did not waste a second. The tires screeched against the pavement as they sped down the road, weaving through empty streets, their heart pounding with every shallow breath the puppy took. "Hold on," they whispered. Their grip on the tiny body tightened, as if their own warmth, their own will, could keep him tethered to life. The city blurred past. Lights. Buildings. Cars. Nothing else mattered. Only him. Only the tiny, helpless soul clinging to the edge of existence. Would they make it in time? Would they be too late? Was this the moment that would save him? Or was he already too far gone? No one had stopped before. No one had seen him before. But tonight, someone had. And that had changed everything. Would he survive? Would he ever learn to trust again, to run, to play, to live? Or had the world already taken too much from him? Only time would tell. But one thing was certain. This little puppy was no longer alone. Because in a world that had turned its back on him, he had finally found hope. This is only the beginning of his journey. If you believe in the power of kindness, stay with me until the end of this story. Because sometimes, all it takes to change a life is one person who refuses to look away. The city lights blurred as the car sped through the empty streets, the cold night air slipping in through the half-open window. The stranger's hands gripped the steering wheel tightly, their heart hammering against their ribs. In their lap, wrapped in a soft coat, the tiny puppy barely moved. His breaths were shallow. His body, too light, too fragile. The stranger stole quick glances down at him, fear creeping into their chest. "Stay with me," they whispered. The vet clinic was only 10 minutes away. But 10 minutes felt like an eternity. Each second ticked by like a countdown. Would they be too late? Would he even make it to the door? They pressed harder on the gas. Not tonight. Not this time. The clinic's doors swung open before the stranger even had time to knock. Dr. Mason, still in his lab coat, eyes filled with urgency, stepped forward. "Set him down here," he instructed, motioning toward the examination table. The stranger placed the puppy down, carefully unwrapping him from the coat. His tiny form barely made a dent in the sterile white cloth beneath him. Dr. Mason's experienced hands moved quickly. A stethoscope pressed against the fragile chest. A thermometer. A flashlight flicked over his dull, glassy eyes. The silence in the room stretched unbearably. Finally, Dr. Mason exhaled. "He is critical. Hypothermia. Dehydration. Severe malnutrition." His eyes flicked to the stranger. "It is a miracle you found him when you did." The stranger's stomach twisted. "I could not just leave him there." Dr. Mason nodded, his face grim. "It is going to be a long night." The stranger pulled a chair closer. They were not leaving. Not now. Not until they knew he was safe. The next few hours were a battle against time. For fluids dripped slowly into the puppy's frail body. A heating pad was placed beneath him, its gentle warmth doing what his body could not. Every few minutes, Dr. Mason checked his pulse, his breathing, the rise and fall of his tiny chest. The stranger never moved from their chair. They watched, waited, prayed. Would he see the morning light? Or was this the end? Hours passed. The room was silent except for the soft beeping of the monitor. And then, a twitch. Barely noticeable. A tiny paw, shifting beneath the blanket. The stranger leaned forward, their breath caught. Dr. Mason, noticing the movement, smiled slightly. "He is still fighting." The word sent a wave of relief crashing over them. Not out of danger. Not yet. But fighting. And that was enough. 2 days later, the first real sign of hope came. The stranger sat beside the small kennel, watching. The puppy was still weak, his movements slow, his body fragile. But his eyes. For the first time, they were open. Not just half-lidded, not just clouded over, but open. Curious. Searching. The stranger held out their hand, letting him see, letting him choose. The tiny nose twitched. A soft, weak sniff. And then, the smallest, gentlest lick. A connection. A trust, however fragile, beginning to form. The stranger smiled, tears pricking at their eyes. "You are a fighter, little one," they whispered. And just like that, he had a name. Fighter. Healing was slow. The first time Fighter tried to stand, his legs wobbled, his tiny paws slipping against the blanket. But he tried. Again. And again. Until finally, he stood. For barely a second. Then he collapsed. But the stranger cheered anyway. Because that second? That was the beginning of something incredible. 4 days, Fighter had been fed through a syringe. Tiny drops of milk. Carefully measured. But now, a real meal. A shallow dish of soft food, placed carefully in front of him. At first, he only stared. Hesitant. As if he did not believe it was truly for him. The stranger dipped their finger in, held it out. A tiny pink tongue flicked out. A taste. Then another. And then, hunger, Deep, desperate hunger kicked in. Fighter ate and ate until, exhausted, he curled up beside the empty dish, his belly round for the first time in his life. The stranger laughed through their tears. He was learning. He was living. Fear that lingered. But some wounds ran deeper than hunger. The first time the stranger raised their voice, just a laugh, a startled sound. Fighter flinched. The first time they reached for him too quickly, he cowered. The first time they opened the front door, he shrank back into the corner, trembling. He was safe. But did he know that? The stranger whispered the same words, night after night. You are safe now. Over and over. Until one day, he believed it. 3 months later, on a bright, warm morning, the stranger took Fighter to the park. A wide, open field stretched before them. Fighter sat at their feet, his ears perked, his tail wagging uncertainly. The stranger knelt beside him, unhooking his leash. You can run now. Fighter looked up, then at the open space. His paws twitched. His ears flicked. For a long moment, he hesitated. Then, he moved. Slowly at first. Then faster. And suddenly, he was running. Tail high. Ears flopping. Free. Happy. Alive. The stranger watched, tears streaming down their face. He had made it. He had won. The shelter called. Fighter was ready for adoption. But the stranger already knew. He was not going anywhere. Fighter had already found his home. Right here. With them. Forever. Fighter had been left to die. But he never stopped fighting. And in the end, he won. Because someone stopped. Someone cared. Someone chose kindness. Would you have made the same decision? Let me know in the comments. If this story touched your heart, a quick like helps more people see it. Because sometimes, all it takes to change a life is one person who refuses to look away. This is just one of many stories of resilience, love, and second chances. Subscribe to be part of a community that believes in hope. Because together, we can change the world, one act of kindness at a time. The phone rang, its sound breaking the gentle hum of the morning. The stranger glanced down at their screen. The shelter. They already knew what this call was about. With a deep breath, they answered. Good morning, the voice on the other end greeted warmly. We are calling about Fighter. He is strong enough now, and we have started looking for his forever home. A silence settled over the room. Fighter, curled up beside them on the couch, lifted his head at the sound of their voice. His ears twitched. His tail gave a slow, lazy wag. A forever home. But was there anywhere in the world that could feel more like home than this? The stranger smiled, their fingers running gently through the soft fur they had once feared would never grow back. I appreciate it, they said finally, voice steady. But he has already found his home. A pause. Then, the shelter worker chuckled. I had a feeling you would say that. It did not take long to make it official. The paperwork was signed. The adoption fee was paid, though it felt more like a formality than anything real. Fighter had been theirs from the moment they saw him. But now, as the final signature was placed on the page, as they carried him out of the shelter not as a foster, not as a temporary rescuer, but as family, it became real. For the first time in his life, Fighter belonged somewhere. For the first time in his life, Fighter belonged to someone. And the best part? He knew it. Fighter's transformation was not just physical. The thin, fragile pup who had once collapsed in the street was now strong. His ribs were no longer visible beneath his fur. His eyes no longer held that haunted, hollow look. And his spirit, that broken, shattered spirit, was whole again. He ran. He played. He lived. But most of all, he loved. And he was loved. It happened one evening. A normal night. A walk through their quiet neighborhood. Fighter trotted beside them, tail wagging, his ears flicking with every new sound. Then, a car passed. Not just any car. A dark-colored one. The same kind of car that had once left him behind. The moment it rolled past, Fighter froze. The stranger stopped walking, their breath catching in their throat. Would he panic? Would the past come rushing back? For a long moment, he stood still. Then, he turned, looked up at them, and wagged his tail. Not out of submission, not out of fear, but out of trust. As if to say, the past cannot hurt me anymore. The stranger exhaled, dropping to their knees, wrapping him in a tight embrace. You are free now, they whispered. And he was. Finally. Completely. free. Fighter's story could have ended on that street. He could have been just another forgotten soul. Just another life that the world chose not to see. But he was not. Because someone stopped. Because someone cared. Because someone refused to walk away. And now? Now he was happy. Now he was loved. Now he was home. Fighter was too weak to stand. But he never stopped fighting. And in the end, he won. Because love saved him. And love? It made him unstoppable. Have you ever rescued an animal? Have you ever seen a life change because of kindness? Share your story in the comments below. Your words can inspire someone today. If this story touched your heart, a quick like helps more people see it. Because sometimes, all it takes to change a life is one person who refuses to look away. This is just one of many stories of resilience, love, and second chances. Subscribe to be part of a community that believes in hope. Because together, we can change the world, one act of kindness at a time.